This lecture deals with kind of the end of the American Revolution. So we were talking in class today about how revolutionary the revolution was. To look back on it a little bit, we need to realize who these people were either before or during the revolution to kind of answer that question. So first of all, we had loyalists, who were those who remained loyal to the crown, obviously. They were government officials, so they already had jobs that were well-paying before the war. They were devout Anglicans, so they wanted a connection with England because of the church. They were merchants who were dependent on trade with England, so they made their money off England. Many religious and ethnic minorities who feared persecution at the hands of the rebels because they thought some of these rebels were extreme. We talked about how Patrick Henry was saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." That sounds a whole lot like some extremists that we deal with today. So, besides loyalists, there are also patriots, who were those who wanted to rebel against the English crown. They were generally white, they were generally Protestant, but not Anglican necessarily, property owners, and gentry, so they were generally wealthier. There were also some urban artisans who would be part of this, who were also generally wealthy, or at least middle class, before the Revolution. Native Americans. Their fears of American expansion led many of them to join the side of the British. They were slaves. The 5,000 were believed that their chances for liberty were better with the English than with the colonists. They joined up with the English, with the royal governor of Virginia offered to free those slaves who escaped to join the British Army. There was an increase in slave insurrections because they feared that they would be better off with the English than they were with the Americans. So you can see, we look at the American Revolution from an American perspective, that it's this great thing. There were several groups, 3 of the 4 groups listed here, thought it was not going to be a good thing for them. Everyone else kind of hoped the whole thing would blow over. So Quakers in Pennsylvania were pacifists and avoided the war. They were trying to really do their own thing, whether it was England or the Americans in charge. So several of them didn't necessarily want change. The Patriots are really the ones who are leading this change. So, speaking of the Patriots, one of the biggest events in the American Revolution is kind of towards the middle part of the Revolution. The Americans are not doing very well. They're not winning this war. So they go, at this point in world history, war was not generally fought during the winter. The muskets wouldn't fire, so they kind of took breaks. So Washington goes out into Pennsylvania in an area named Valley Forge, and it's 20 miles west of the British. He and his troops endure this horrible winter. It's horribly cold. They don't have decent food. They don't have clothing. They don't have shelter. One of the beauties of Washington was his ability to continue to keep these people actually fighting, because they're risking their lives literally by fighting. They're risking their lives because they're committing treason. And they're not exactly having a good time, whether because of lack of winds or because of the hardships that they're suffering. So in the winter of 1777, the winter of 1778, as they're losing the war, they're losing men because of desertion, his greatest challenge was keeping these people together, and as I said, many of them lacked blankets, shoes, shirts. They made moccasins out of scraps of cowhide. They deserted, and even officers resigned. Volunteers, including George Washington's wife, Martha, actually made clothes for the troop and try to care for the sick. By April of 1778, those who did stick around were much stronger, and Washington will use, as the spring kind of dawns, some ability to train them a little bit before they get back to the war, and that will pay off. There's another part of the American army that is going to win the Battle of Saratoga, and Washington is able to tell his troops in April of 1778, as the spring is occurring, that we are going to get an alliance with France, and their spirits raise greatly. So this winter of Valley Forge is very synonymous with the struggle that Americans had, especially early on in the Revolution. So again, Saratoga is in northern New York. British were defeated, and it stopped them from cutting off New England from the rest of the country and ending the war. Remember, the British policy was divide and conquer. So this battle stops them from being able to do that. They lack the knowledge of geography and have poor communications. So this is the battle that shows the French that we can actually possibly win this war. So in 1778, we make an alliance with France. They provide soldiers, training, a navy, and money in order for us to continue. So it's negotiated by Ben Franklin in 1778, and it brings the French into the war on the side of us, which will be really one of the deciding factors in why we're able to hold out and win. So jumping ahead, as we said, we're not going to study too much in terms of military history. We studied Lexington and Concord, the first battles. We studied Saratoga, the turning point, and then Yorktown is the final battle. So after several battles like Monmouth, etc., the Americans are starting to win, and they're able to push General Cornwallis to an area in Virginia that was kind of a peninsula called Yorktown. Cornwallis wants to winter his troops there. In the South, believing the war would be won in the spring, it was chosen because it provided easy access to be reinforced and resupplied. So Washington learned the British decision to winter, and he sends a bunch of different troops to Cornwallis in Yorktown, which will kind of be the final major battle of the American Revolution. So the British are going to run into George Washington's strategy, which he uses the French Navy to kind of barricade the British and French and American troops on the ground. There's Admiral de Grasse, who placed a blockade around Chesapeake Bay, keeps the English from getting resupplied. 15,000 American troops surrounded 8,000 British troops. Cornwallis is the leader of the British army and is trapped, and he's forced to surrender, which eventually brings the war to an end. So as we bring the war to the end, we are now the United States of America. We are no longer colonists. So the Treaty of Paris in 1783, don't get confused with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, that's the one that ends the French and Indian War. In 1783, we win the American Revolution. The major points of the treaty were that Britain had to recognize us as an independent country. And we said that the U.S. acquired the land from the Great Lakes to Florida and to the Atlantic coast and to the Mississippi River. So those are our borders. And you can see we don't have Florida at first, and there's a little bit of a discrepancy between New Orleans and that area that will eventually become the state of Louisiana, who claims it, the United States and the Spanish. But we'll deal with that later. The British were to remove their troops and forts from the U.S. land, and we were supposed to pay back the debts to the Loyalists because we destroyed much of their property, so the British wanted them protected. That is not going to happen at first, and because of that, the British do not leave the American soil, especially out in the West, and that's eventually going to cause the War of 1812 later on. So we're not exactly over with all the issues with Britain, but you can see that this is kind of the starting of actual American history as a nation. So now that we have won the American Revolution, the Americans have thrown King George off their back. The question is, now what? What kind of government are we going to set up? How are we going to finance that government? Some of the nuts and bolts questions of the American Revolution get brought up, and it's going to be a little while before we figure those out. But that ends the American